So I'm Taylor Sims. I'm the Public Engagement and Professionalization Grad Coordinator for the History Department. And this is just one in a series of conversations with alumni. This is actually a reunion of a panel, what I wish I had known in graduate school from the Alumni Conference last year. So if you could all just introduce yourselves briefly, that would be great.
All right, I can start. Since that button just popped up. So I'm Rebekah Pite. I finished my PhD in 2007 in History and Women's Studies. And I am now an Associate Professor of History at Lafayette College, which is a liberal arts college in Pennsylvania.
I'm Tamar Caroll. I also finished my dissertation in 2007 from the Department of History, and I'm now an associate professor and department chair in the Department of History at Rochester Institute of Technology.
I'm Parna Sengupta. I finished my PhD in 2000 in history, and I am now an associate vice provost in Stanford Introductory Studies.
Hey everyone, I'm Minayo Nasiali. I defended in 2010, and I'm now an associate professor at UCLA in California.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you for just taking the initiative to jump right in. I think that's how this is going to have to work on Zoom. So if you can think back, to when you were in the program, but even further, when you started, what motivated you to apply for a PhD in history and kind of pursue graduate school, specifically in a history department? And then did you find that your motivations changed over the course of the program, kind of moving from coursework to prelims to dissertating to everything else that was involved? Did you find that your motivations for starting kind of evolved over time?
So I was, after college, I worked for 5 years in a variety of capacities, and I learned something from each of those jobs. I taught English in Spain. I worked in consulting, which I really was not for me. And then I worked in a food and nutrition group at a public relations firm. And I think really it came up to me missing intellectual discussions and also forming opinions based on what I thought and based on evidence rather than what my clients were paying me to advocate for. And so I realized that graduate school was a really unique way to pursue that, and was so excited when I came back to Michigan. And I had been out of school for 5 years, getting to spend time in the library reading books and have discussions with my classmates. And I was nervous too, to be sure. I felt a little bit unique in that I had taken so much time in between. And to the second question, I'd say the biggest shift between when I started and why I started, which was a little bit more individual, I think became much more collective over the course of my graduate education. I really came to see just how essential it was to study and be able to explain the very systematic intersectional inequalities that structure all of our lives, and that if I didn't understand and couldn't help somebody else who hadn't had access to this kind of education understand how ideas like gender and race and class and sexuality work together, then I felt that really became much more important to me, both in my teaching and my research over the course of my studies there.
I think that one of the things that motivated me to go to grad school was studying with Kathy Pice. When I was an undergrad at UMass Amherst, I took her History of Sexuality seminar, and she's just a phenomenal teacher and historian. I also double majored in journalism, and I interned at several newspapers, and I found myself really frustrated by the lack of depth that I was able to address issues that I thought were important, and the concern with bringing in revenue, which was understandable, but basically at times I felt that was limiting the content, that concern about advertising revenue was influencing the newsroom decisions that were being made about what stories to run. And I just wanted more freedom to really go into trying to understand how things became the way they are and how they might be different in the future. So that was what motivated me. I did not take any time off in between undergrad and graduate school. I don't necessarily recommend that. But that's what I did. And so I think I was just learning so much in graduate school because I was in my early 20s, you know, when I started. So I was learning a lot just about growing up, as well as learning about becoming a historian and a scholar. So it's hard for me to say whether my motivations changed. Definitely my the scope of things that I was interested in broadened, and I agree with what Rebekah said, that, you know, being able to, I think being a teaching assistant was really important to my development, because it was one thing to be learning in a graduate seminar with peers, but then trying to communicate those ideas to undergraduate students. And it was a little rocky at first, but I'm really grateful for that experience, and it made me a much better historian.
So I also came to graduate school very soon after my undergrad. I think there was a year in between. And I think it was not that fully thought through a decision at the time, like many decisions are. It was partially serendipity. But if I could point to a couple of things I think that were important, it was actually that I had a couple of undergraduate mentors who really said, you should think about graduate school. And honestly, that, and I'm saying that in some ways to kind of piggyback on this teaching issue, like I do actually think that there's something very special about that teacher-student relationship. And for me, I think that was me on the receiving end of that. That was really very powerful, and that I remember very well. When I came to Michigan, I came, I think, for the program. So I came because there was a particular set of faculty I wanted to work with, et cetera. And my field, which was South Asia, there weren't a ton of PhD granting institutions that it would make sense to go to. I didn't know that much about Michigan, but I think what really changed is, I think almost, I would say so much of my learning was about my community of peers. And so it was really you know, when I was in Michigan in the 1990s, at that time, the lawsuit had not been filed. And so there was, I felt like a really full-throated commitment to diversity in a very deep way. And I think I feel so strongly about the institution because of that experience. And I think that experience for me then has really shaped how I think about the field, what I think is important to do, and what I think like is normal in a field. So for me, I'm at Stanford now. One of the things, like when I first got here, it was just so shocking to me to look at what the faculty looked like. You know, I kind of couldn't believe it. And I think that, to me, I'm grateful that Michigan made me feel like this is not normal and this is not acceptable. So I think for me that you know, this is the piece I feel very emotional about. When I was there, I feel this was such a deep commitment, and I hope it continues, because I think this is then what you get to send out to the world, is people who will be like, this is not normal for a history department to look like this or to be represented in this way. So.
Well, thank you. So like Parna and Tamar, I think I took maybe 1 year off before I came to Michigan. So it wasn't really, I hadn't really fully thought through exactly what I was getting myself into. So in many ways, I grew along with my progress in the program. But one of the things that I think one kind of point I would draw attention to in undergrad was writing an honors thesis. Actually, I know a lot of undergrads write an honors thesis, and for me, it was not just the experience of doing the research and getting excited about the scholarship, but it was also the mentoring. And I got some good advice. Specifically, I was told, go into a discipline, go into history. I was deciding between history and comp lit. Go into history. It's a discipline, and it was a good piece of advice. And at Michigan, only now having left, I think, do I really fully appreciate what a community of scholars I feel like I had the opportunity to engage with, both with graduate students who I felt were always incredibly generous in their willingness to share their materials, like grant proposals, whatever. And also I felt like I could approach any faculty member at Michigan, and they could, you know, office hours was a time where I could approach people who just weren't my advisors. There's a real earnestness, I think, about Michigan that I think has been important for me as a scholar. Going to other institutions, you know, sometimes there can be a little bit of hubris about the institution, and I think the fact that at Michigan there was a commitment to good work and an earnestness about that has made me think about, you know, not how to be a scholar, but how to be a teacher, and how to kind of really think about taking seriously the kinds of questions that undergrads may ask, which may not always see, you know, which are coming from various different perspectives, and taking very seriously the fact that what they have to say matters.
That's excellent. Thank you all so much. These are all so great to hear. And as you reflect on your experiences, I hear so much of my own, you know, in all of these. So the next question kind of dovetails with that one, and it revisits the topic that we discussed on our panel, because it was things I wish I had known in graduate school. I can't seem to say that sentence properly. There are probably so many things I wish I had known before I started. But specifically in terms of professionalization, which is kind of a big word with a really simple meaning in our current department initiative, is just preparing students in a variety of ways to develop skills that might help them for careers, you know, alongside or beyond academia. So the question, you know, I sent you is, what do you wish you'd known? Anything specifically in terms of professionalization? And that's a broad umbrella, kind of things outside of the typical trajectory of a PhD program that then land you in an academic job. So I was just wondering if any of you, you know, looking back, have anything you wish you had done or wish you had known in terms of professionalization?
So if I could start. So this is something I've been thinking about a lot, because the program that I help direct has, you know, is a 3-year teaching fellowship. And for the people who are coming up on the end of their 3rd year in March and April of this year, like it felt like the world completely exploded, but especially there was an intense level of anxiety about what it meant for their future prospects, not just the immediate next year, but for a couple of years out. And so this is something I feel that I have professionally been living with quite a bit, thinking about not just like what I wish I knew, but the fact that I could never have known this, just as none, you know, so I think that at any moment, these things, like, it's hard even to extrapolate. However, I'll just speak therefore more about what I have been thinking about with like, you know, and working with the recent PhDs. And one thing is I think for institutions, and so this is a comment really aimed less at the grad students and more at the department and perhaps at Rackham, is that one of the things we're really thinking about at Stanford is trying to create fellowships that give graduate students some experience in other kinds of administrative work in a much more intentional way. So not something you know, I would of course encourage everyone to get whatever experience they can, you know, running conferences, and if you can get on editorial boards, all of that's important. But I feel like it's also incumbent on institutions to think of this slightly more systematically, and not just that it be a kind of individual responsibility to gain lots of different kinds of professional opportunities. And so I'll just speak about that one piece, which I do think it's very hard to get certain kinds of experience unless a system is set up. So to get, for example, getting to work in an office that is working on a longer term project. So our office really does a lot of curricular development for undergraduates. Like this is a great thing if we could have graduate students also be a part of it and it to be formalized. So it to be a fellowship program or to be a partial fellowship, or what, you know, different places can organize it differently. But I think trying to institutionally thinking about ways even within, especially at Michigan, which like Stanford is a huge institution with lots of different parts, there really are, I think, some real possibilities. And so I would strongly encourage to think about some I think it's hard just at a departmental level, but it sounds like the history department is doing that, but really for Rackham to take this up. I think that this is important. And I do think that the post PhD market is just different. It will be different. It's hard to know exactly what it'll look like, but it will, I do believe that it'll be significantly different.
I guess I can offer a couple thoughts. Just to follow up on what you said, Parna, I was in a meeting of the Central New York Humanities Corridor, and they were suggesting that maybe about 1 out of every 10 current PhD students might wind up working their whole career in a tenure track position. So that means 9 would be doing, various other kinds of jobs. So I think what you said is important. I think in terms of it, I think a couple things besides just having that. I think it's wonderful that Michigan is doing internships with ProQuest. I think I would definitely encourage graduate students. I never thought about that, and I think that that's wonderful and a great opportunity to follow up on. For graduate students collecting sources for your dissertation, I would say, I'm sure you are collecting them digitally. If you're doing oral history interviews, if you can do video interviews, and just be thinking about having multiple audiences down the road like that. Doing a dissertation, it's such a huge amount of research labor. And so it would be wonderful if it makes its way into a monograph, but and scholarly articles, but maybe it will also become an exhibit someday, or become a short documentary film, or a long, there's so many different possibilities, or maybe it becomes a web exhibit, So I would be thinking about how you can engage audiences at different levels, because it's really fulfilling to do that, but it also is helpful, I think, on the job market. And I also think it's helpful if you can sort of find a scholarly organization that you would like to take part in, and consistently go to that conference, and really get to know people, and maybe volunteer to take on some duties as an officer, or at least to be organizing panels, something like that. I think for myself, I'm interested in women's and gender history, but also urban history and political history. And the problem is, I think sometimes I spread too thin. And so one of the things I've been trying to do lately is to decide which organizations I really want to prioritize my commitment to. And so that's not to say to only ever go to one conference. I mean, I think it is great to benefit from big conferences where you can meet lots of people. But I think it's helpful if you find one organization that you really want to commit to, because then those people can write letters for you and mentor you. And that's something that's important as you leave Michigan. You don't want only your committee members to be mentoring you anymore. You want to have mentors at other institutions.
I'm going to speak of a colleague, actually. I can't name this colleague's name, although I wish I could, because this person is wonderful. And this colleague decided that the traditional tenure track route just wasn't for them. And so this colleague has forged a new path in kind of consulting, focusing especially on questions of diversity and systemic inequities, but has simultaneously published a monograph, continues to participate in the big conferences as recommends. And so is also by kind of forging these kind of two paths or multiple paths, is bringing them to the kind of stodgy academic circles, a really important perspective, showing that this person can, is able and is willing and is interested in pursuing the research and the publications, but then brings to that work this kind of broad perspective that I think ultimately only betters and only contributes in multiple ways to the broader endeavor. The other, I wish I learned how to write an op-ed in grad school. So I think I'm going to have to ask this colleague for some pointers, because I think this person has really kind of demonstrated in a serious manner the full way of being a thoughtful intellectual citizen.
Yeah, I agree with really everything that's been said thus far. And I was thinking beforehand too that I wish I had learned an op-ed. So I was like, yes, absolutely. I mean, I think one specific recommendation I have, which may already be occurring, I don't know, but is some kind of history writing for the public course that somebody could teach. I've been participating in a writing group since last spring, and it's been incredibly helpful in terms of thinking about how to organize writing, the time frames in which to write, as well as the publics to which you're writing, and how to pitch things. And I had amazing mentors in graduate school who gave me such close feedback on my writing, but it was always within the genre of a dissertation chapter or a seminar paper, or eventually, a book, but an academic book. And so I would love to have had and to encourage current generation of grad students to get the opportunity to really think about writing to multiple publics, and then broaden that out, to Tamar's point, to reach multiple publics through a variety of means, through perhaps in-person or online exhibits, as she mentioned, documentaries, all these different venues that we have. And also perhaps, kind of piggybacking on what Parna was saying before, creating institutional opportunities to develop some of those skills, because they're all skills, right? If you asked me to make a documentary about my dissertation, I wouldn't really know how to do it, right? I know how to write a dissertation chapter or a book even now at this point, but I don't know how to make a documentary. I've been working and trying to figure out how to build a digital exhibit, for example, right? But those were skills I had to really invest time in, get caught up on. And I think for this generation of graduate students would be really crucial in broadening the types of things that they could do and the types of venues in which they could work as well. And I love that example too that you gave of your colleague, Minayo, and the ways in which it doesn't have to be one or the other necessarily.
Rebekah, could I just say, I think teamwork is something that's really important to learn, and that's not something that was really emphasized in my graduate training. We're individual and sometimes competitive, and I can't make a film on my own, but I can work with other people, right? And I think the same thing, like when I work on a museum exhibit, I may be writing text for it, but other people are doing the layout and the design work because I don't have those skills. So I think much of what I do that of my work that's public facing is I'm involved in teamwork and managing team dynamics, right? And then as a department chair, a lot of what I'm doing too is trying to get people to work as a team, managing interpersonal dynamics. So I think that's actually a really valuable skill to have, and it's applicable to many different contexts. So teamwork and leadership and project management are all really useful skills.
And if I could say one more thing that I meant to say based on Minayo's comment about her colleague, it leads me back to when I came to grad school, that your earlier question you had asked me. I had been working in public relations, where the whole point is you're trying to reach a public with a really captivating message. It's got to be clear, it's got to be punchy. And I go to my first academic conference and I'm listening to people reading their papers like this and not making eye contact. And I'm like, what is this? Like, these people really do this, and then that becomes normalized for you because we don't have that many experiences necessary with other people that have other skills to teach us and other ways of presenting information that are really useful.
This is all excellent. And if it's all right with you guys, I might skip for now to the last question because it seems more natural to go there. How do you see the role of public engagement in your work? And we can always circle back to those others, but it seems like our conversation is kind of heading this way. So I think we should go there now. You've kind of talked about skills that you are developing now or wish you had, but in your current work, how do you kind of conceive of the role of public engagement? Some may be more obvious than others, but in your respective roles, you know, where is public engagement for you?
Well, I serve on the board of the Susan B. Anthony House, and this is my first year in that role. So I'm learning about being on a board of trustees and thinking about fundraising, which is not something that I have a lot of experience in. So that's something that I'm learning, and I'm grateful for that opportunity, and thinking about advocating. You know, this is a tough year for museums as well as for universities. So thinking about advocating for historical societies and museums, and so that's one way. And I give a lot of public talks, so because I focus on women's history, and this is the suffrage centennial, I've been giving talks and emphasizing, you know, the history of voting rights, as well as the history of voter suppression, and just how important it is to vote. And so that's a way that I can address audiences beyond my students at RIT. And I mentioned that I have done exhibit work, and right now my students are actually doing a virtual exhibition of suffrage posters that I hope will be good enough to make public facing, and share their work. So those are some of the ways that I'm currently engaging public audiences.
I can say something. So this is actually maybe smooshes together some of the earlier questions, because this is actually about the kind of post-COVID moment. So one of the things that I think has become, because our unit in part runs a teaching fellowship, but also because we think a lot about pedagogy, et cetera. One of the things that's really been interesting is the degree to which there has been a real collaborative effort to try to pool resources, pedagogic resources, as everyone suddenly had to move online, many of whom had never taught online. And so this was a kind of interesting moment for me, because I don't think generally of my work as public facing at all, but this was a moment when, as a unit, different people in our group, so for example, we have a number of people who do academic technology. So, you know, as they were developing things to think about materials that could be widely disseminated, you know, kind of how-tos, best practices, etc. And so, as awful as this period has been, it's also been a kind of interestingly disruptive moment, I think, for teaching. And even, you know, in institutions like the one I'm currently in, where it's hard to get faculty to pay attention to teaching, this suddenly became a moment when, like, all of our teaching workshops were full because people were terrified of having to go on Zoom. And so it's been a very, you know, in I think maybe, you know, when I think of it in its best possible way, where there's really been across the world, really not even specific to the United States, across the world, a kind of effort to share and collaborate on thinking about this transition to online teaching. And so for me, this has been a kind of moment when which has been more public facing than I would have ever had anticipated, I think, earlier. So.
Do you want to go, Minayo?
I can, but if you're ready, go ahead.
Go ahead.
So I was actually, Rebekah, thinking about something you said at the conference last year, you know, pre everything, when you talked about your research and the kind of big thematic questions that you were interested in, which were public facing. And similarly for me, I think I'm now kind of starting to really think in a much broader way about, you know, how the work that I'm interested in can be, how I can think of the multiple audiences of that work. So my dissertation, which became my book, was looking at housing inequity and racial injustice, right? And so the communities I was working with in Marseille, the networks that I tried to tap into there, you know, these were activists who were incredibly committed to these big systemic inequities. And so the big conversation in France is that there's no race, there's no racism, there aren't these kinds of American problems. And that's kind of the ongoing kind of drumbeat in public discourse. And so what these activists are saying is actually, there are these systemic inequities. And so, by a roundabout way, the research that I did was amplifying and giving voice to some of the voices that weren't, who are struggling to kind of make themselves heard in France. But that being said, I think I can do more. I think that, for me, it's kind of an intellectual journey where I'm now that I feel like I'm almost figured out this game of the academy, I've figured out the vocabularies and the performances and all that there's room now for me to really be serious. So right now I'm working on, a project on sailors, colonial sailors. Well, these were essential workers, right? These were the most vulnerable workers in the 1920s and 1930s were also our most essential workers because they shipped our world's goods. So for me, it's about being serious about making those connections and also integrating it into the teaching in a major way. And then for me, making more of a commitment, I think, to reaching out to be more public facing.
That's so cool. And I love the connections you're making between the context, because I think one of the things I talked about last year was, as somebody who focuses on South America in particular, which is obviously, but works in the United States, the challenges of doing public facing work in the United States. Because in Argentina, I actually realized, thank you for inviting me to this conference, because I hadn't thought about it that way before, but I do all kinds of public facing scholarship there. I've been so fortunate to be able to give a bunch of media interviews in all kinds of different venues where what I've researched gets out to a much broader audience. I helped curate a museum exhibition there about mates, which is my new project. And kind of like Tamar was saying, I did the textual part of it, and other people who are experts in setting up exhibits did that other part. With my students, I've been thinking, I think I mentioned this last year too, but I've been having them do historical exhibits in this class I teach that's called Global Stimulants. And so they're looking at things like labor exploitation, which is endemic to the production of global stimulants, as well as, the gendered and racialized advertisements that are being sold to women in the United States, especially. They tend to look at the US, but they could look anywhere and find trends that they're able to dig into with a different, more critical lens. And so I kind of like Minayo, I feel like I'm on a journey to figure out the ways in which I can make that more relevant in the context in which I teach and work. I find in my teaching, I teach a lot of Americas classes, because one of my main goals is just to have students leave the class thinking we are directly connected to the rest of the Americas, and it's only a kind of ideological position that we consider ourselves a separate continent, and they actually, for example, in Argentina, where I've done most of my work, consider us all one continent. And so seeing the ways in which, the wealth of some people in the United States has really been bolstered by the exploitation of Latin American laborers, for example, on banana plantations, is not what my research is about, but it's a lot of what my teaching is about, or talking about the ways in which poor women's domestic labor often supports and allows then more privileged women to go into the labor force and get higher paying jobs is another thing I teach a lot about. And that's really connected to my research, but I haven't necessarily found the way to make that, an op-ed, for example. Somebody told me the other day, you should write an op-ed about, the inequities around caring work and domestic work in COVID times. And I know a lot of people have, so it's not necessarily like there's a vacuum there. But I thought, oh, yeah, that would be great. When will I do that? But I would like to do something like that in the future.
Thank you all. This is great. You're making me think of so many things, like Minayo, your comment about like, once I figured out the rules of the game, now I'm thinking, how can I do more? It highlights this issue of like, if you're in the academy, who has the bandwidth and the time to be doing this? And like, who has the privilege of extra time to write an op-ed, and making us question issues of access to public engagement at the graduate level also, I think is really important. And then Rebekah, your point of thinking about like what our work could be, like thinking about the academic work you do and then kind of dreaming about other lives it could have outside the academy, I think is really great. So we only have a few minutes left. I don't want to keep you any longer than I promised because your time is valuable. If there's anything else you want to raise, please do. But the last question I'll kind of ask, and then you can, talk about whatever you want, is this: how has COVID-19 impacted your work? And then maybe more generally, just how are you doing? How are you adapting in this moment in your respective positions and as human beings? Because that's important too.
Well, my two kids are currently napping, and I'm very thankful that they're still napping throughout this conversation. I mean, this question of bandwidth, Rebekah, I was like, when am I going to write an op-ed, right? How am I going to, as I'm very fortunate to have a job, I'm very thankful. But, COVID has really, I think, as has been widely discussed, really exposed and laid bare the kinds of work, the gendered work, the ways in which work happens, and who has the time to do it. But it's also been disruptive. I like that word, Parna. In terms of teaching, right? I mean, I taught last semester or last quarter, and it was an opportunity to try a new experiment. My students kept a journal, which I'd never done before, and at the end, they wrote either a blog or they did a podcast around whatever topic most of them chose COVID. So for them, it was a chance to really kind of think about the broad, important circle themes we were discussing and apply them in their contemporary experience. And so that was good. In terms of research, that trip to Liverpool did not happen last summer, but now I have an ancestry.com subscription, and I'm trying to see, how I can track my sailors that way.
I'm nodding so hard because I scheduled this for when my 6-month-old would be napping. So I'm like, I feel that very deeply.
Well, and I think there's like a low level tension when you're dependent upon a nap to do work that's really crucial. And that, I think, is part of what is hard to exactly explain, but shifts things, right? So I was really fortunate in that I was on sabbatical in the spring, and I was starting to write my current book, and I got a month in, and then everybody was home, and I'm also very fortunate in that my kids are older and they don't need me to physically care for them so they don't topple over, or so that they have enough to eat all the time. They're 11 and 15, or they were then. Or sorry, now they're 11 and 15, they were 10 and 14. Anyway, point being, right, it just is a different dynamic. And the kind of deep intellectual work we do, I think, requires a certain amount of quiet and focus and bandwidth that is really hard to summon when you're surrounded by a lot of other people's needs and wants who you love, right, and who you want to care for. At the same time, I will say, I think the impact of COVID has been so unequal on, and I feel like for current graduate students, for my pre-tenure colleagues, being in a moment where you're trying to get a job or being judged while also navigating this moment feels like a whole different order of magnitude to me. And so, I'm on a committee right now in my department. We're trying to figure out, what do we do with the tenure standards in this moment? I mean, what can people realistically be expected to produce? And so, like Minayo, I was hoping to go to Argentina and Paraguay, and I don't know that that's going to happen, but it's also not that big of a deal for me. I have to put it off, but it's not going to change my trajectory that much. But I do worry, and I hope I've been impressed I've been reading what the AHA has been having to say about this, and I hope that at the institutional level, there's a lot of thought given to it. And also the ways in which it's uniquely difficult for historians, right? It's not the same for other academics. There are other scholars who also depend on field research, and for them too, I would say it's similar, but we're kind of uniquely impacted, and especially for folks who need to do the research in order to do the writing of a dissertation or articles or whatever it may be. But that was really negative. Let me say one positive thing. I think the positive is that it's forcing us to do other things, right? Like you were using ancestry.com. There are an amazing wealth of digital sources that are available if you have the time to look for them. And normally, if you took the time to go to the field, you don't have the time to look at them as well. So maybe that is a bit of a silver lining.
Yeah, we're at our Council of Chairs meeting next week. One of the topics is productivity and what are reasonable standards of productivity for faculty. I have been encouraging my faculty to not feel pressure to be productive this year because frankly, the switch to online teaching, which many of them are teaching fully online or partially online, it's involved a lot of course preparation and a lot of time. And yeah, none of us could go to the archives over the summer. Some people have digitized sources that they can be using, but even if they do, it's really a time issue. And I think people are feeling just sort of generally distraught about the pandemic and the political situation in the United States as well. So I think I've been trying to just like do what I can, writing some book reviews this fall that they could mail me the books, so that was fine. And I had an article that I got revisions on, and it took a long time because I had to get, like, the interlibrary loan had stopped for a while. Like we couldn't do interlibrary loan but now it's working again. So I got the books I needed, and that's due in November. So hopefully I'll have it done by the deadline. But I'm not really trying to do, beyond that, I'm not trying to do a lot of new work right now. And part of me feels sad about that, but like Rebekah said, I think it'll be okay, you know. And one thing RIT has done is give everyone who wants it a year extension for tenure, which I think is good. I guess it's hard to say. We just don't know the full extent of the pandemic yet, and like when people might be able to go back. And it may impact, for example, like when I go up for full. But, you know, I guess I'm just trying to do what I can this fall and not worry too much about that. Because ultimately, if I go up a year or two later, it doesn't really matter. But we have been asked to think about the ways it's impacting women faculty in particular. I can say, like, my daughter, fortunately, we're able to put her in a private kindergarten. So it's open 5 days a week right now. But if she was in the public school, she'd only have 6 hours of kindergarten. So obviously that's like a privilege that we're able to pay for that private kindergarten. I hope it stays open. We don't know. Over the summer, she had been going to daycare at RIT and they closed down. So she had no care over the summer. And it was extremely stressful to be like on these long Zoom meetings to try to plan the reopening of campus and being like, well, do I let my daughter watch TV for 3 hours? You know, like that's not good for her. So, so that was hard, and we may wind up back there again. I really hope not. Yeah. But I think it's important to be pressuring decision makers at the university, you know, to at least recognize that the amount of caregiving work has gone up substantially because of schools and daycare centers being closed.
I realize we're well at time, but I'll just briefly say, so I had a change in my position, which was great, a promotion, exactly like March 1st was the day I started, which was, so this has been a really challenging time. I think partially because when that started, there was a lot of concern about the budget. And so there was a lot of anxiety about people losing their jobs in our unit. We thankfully, that did not happen, but it didn't happen by us not rehiring certain kinds of staff positions. So I think I think everyone's just working a lot more, I think, across the board. And I'll say one thing that has really, I think, become very clear in this process. So in the unit that I direct, there's both academic staff, so people who teach, and then there's administrative staff. And for administrative staff, sort of central HR has thought about things like X number of hours of caregiving and things like that, right? And there's really been almost little or no thought for administrative staff, for academic staff. Faculty can decide not to teach, or they can push it off, or blah, blah, blah. And so it's just really, to me, highlighted this group. These are lecturers, sometimes on term, sometimes on long-term kinds of contracts, but the HR kind of support is almost non-existent for them. And that has just become so clear through this process. And that is something I think is just really, unjust and wrong. And I think that it's become very hard to figure out how, for people who are academic staff, how to address this kind of caregiving issue, like systematically, not just individual kinds of exceptions and negotiations. So I think this is something that universities really, I don't imagine that my university is unique in this problem of how to think about this question and some kind of equity around these issues. So.
Thank you all so much for not only sharing your time, but your experiences kind of in this difficult moment, kind of in your busy schedules and across time zones. I know it can be hard to find the time. So thank you.